Well, I'm very honored to have been invited to share the same virtual room with Marion and with Joel Greenberg, whose book is the most comprehensive account ever written about a bird I've loved and mourned since my earliest memories. My grandpa told me about the passenger pigeon when I was very little, little enough to be sitting on his lap. His own grandpa had told him of seeing large flocks of passenger pigeons in Wisconsin long before my grandpa was born in 1896. And he also told me about the people massacring them. When he was still a teenager, he read in a newspaper about the death of Martha, the very last passenger pigeon. And he told me how sad that made him. Between the wholesale massacre of the birds and fighting in World War One, my grandpa told me once he returned from the war, he decided he would never, ever pick up a gun again in his life. His sorrow was palpable as he held me on his lap, his cheek against mine, and ever since I felt a deep-seated need to protect birds so that doesn't happen to other species, though it has since that time. I'm going to be asking Joel about his wonderful book, including some suggested questions from readers. But first, Joel, tell us a little about Project Passenger Pigeon and the documentary film From Billions to None.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be part of this as well. Yeah, so 2014 was the centenary of the pigeon's extinction, and there was the notion that we could use this as a teaching moment to tell people about the story, and it is a powerful story. Hopefully, that would be a portal into more interest in the issues that you just mentioned, Laura. And a key moment in this project was in February of 2011. Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum in Chicago. Chicago has not just one, but two nature museums. We had people from literally, all over. We had people from Cornell and from the Smithsonian and um, Wesleyan in Connecticut, and Gary Landry came up from Louisiana. I mean, we had a lot of people, and out of that came Project Passenger Pigeon, um, which, as I said, I mean, there were many activities as a consequence. So there was my book, and you mentioned the documentary that I did with David Mrazek, who's a really excellent filmmaker, and um, it was shown on a very many PBS stations. Um, DC and even Los Angeles. I mean, lots of places people had an opportunity to see it. There were over 200 um, institutions did something, either a talk or an exhibit or publishing. I personally gave about maybe 70 talks in 22 states and two provinces, traveling constantly. Other people also gave talks. So it and we had some TV time. It was on a bunch of radio stations scattered from coast to coast. So we were very pleased with it. There's also a website which had been down for a while, and it's now run by Notebaert. But if anyone's interested, it has all gives you really detailed information about the pigeon in terms of you know its status in various states and a bunch of other things as well. So you might want to look at that Project Passenger Pigeon, the website. So that's some
Okay,
of what we did.
now give us some background about the passenger pigeon. What made it unique and special?
Well, I was thinking of maybe three things. One is the sheer size of the population. Now we don't know exactly. There was a Shorger, A.W. Shorger of Madison wrote a book in 1955 on the pigeon, and he used all kinds of data. He came up with an estimate of from 3 to 5 billion birds.
And
So there
that's
was the
billion with a B.
with a B, exactly. And not only it's not like oh, I don't know, white-footed mice which are scattered. These would form immense um, flocks. Um, the It was also the case that um, you didn't have to go to a remote area to see them. I mean, they darkened the skies over um, New York in the 1700s, early 1800s. As time went on, they were less abundant on the East Coast, but in the Midwest, Chicago, Cleveland, Minneapolis, they all, um, on a given day, you could see huge numbers of them. I mean, one example, um, John Audubon was a co-owner of a store in Henderson, Kentucky on the Ohio River. And one time he was going on a business trip to Louisville. Um, and in the course of the like 2 days that it took him to get there, the sky was black by the pigeons. I mean, they were just, um, there in huge numbers. And so, um, you know, that made an impact, and it did. It affected the arts. I mean, people were aware of it. Second is that huge population was reduced to zero in decades. So around 1860, a fellow named Major King, an officer in the British Army, decided to do some traveling through Canada, and he was in Mississauga, Ontario, not that far from Toronto, and he had a flight of birds um, that lasted maybe 3 days, and he didn't give a number to it, but he said how far away from them they were, how long the flocks were, how deep the flocks were. And this is a guy who was trained, by one of the premier armies of the world. So I think he would have been better able to do those estimates than maybe the average person. And people have modern scientists, at least three that I know of, have looked at this, and um, it was likely that he at that one place over those 3 days there were anywhere from 2 to 3 billion birds. That range is in part dependent on how fast the birds were flying. If they were flying on the low end, there'd be fewer. At the high end, there'd be more. So, you know, billions in 1860, and we could talk more about this, but the last wild birds were gone really in the first few years of the 20th century. And, the last bird died in 1914. And so the third thing that I think makes this um, extraordinary and makes it easier to probably relate to is that we know with a fair degree of certainty who the last bird was when it died. So that bird, it was probably born in Chicago and it was sent to Cincinnati early on in its life. It They called the zoo called the two remaining pigeons George and Martha after the Washingtons, and so Martha George died in I don't know, like 1912 or so. So for 2 years, Martha was the last of her species, and then at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on September 1st, 1914, she died, and the pigeon ceased to be a living thing. I mean, there were other, and that's, I don't know if that's unique, but for example, there was the last, Incas was the last captive Carolina parakeet that also was in the Cincinnati Zoo. Incas died in 1918, but it's almost certain, certainly in my mind, that there were still birds in the wild. Um, but Martha, there hadn't been any wild birds with certainty for almost 10 years. So, that makes a difference. So I would say those would probably be at least three of the things that made it special. Something relevant throughout this, and I may mention it again, is it's important to keep in mind that no one ever studied the passenger pigeon in the wild. So the only research done on the bird was the captive flock at the University of Chicago. Um, and So a lot of what we know about the bird, the people going in killing them. As far as I know, no one attempted to watch them, and record how the birds actually, interacted with each other. So that's an important point when we consider the fate of the bird.
Tell me about the habitat they needed and what food they ate.
Sure. They like the deciduous forests. They ate many things. Shorter lists, I don't know, 50, 60 species of plants they ate. So they ate seeds, they ate insects, they ate fruit. But not all, but most of the big concentrations were within easy access of masting, oak, and beech. So masting is an event that occurs periodically, depending on the species of tree, depending on the weather, um, whereby there is a surfeit of acorns or beech nuts produced. That ensures that that there would be reproduction. An analogy among animals would be periodic cicadas. The same thing. There's so many of them emerge that predators aren't going to be able to take a significant amount. So those are the oaks, various species of oaks, and beech are the two groups with which they're most associated.
What methods did people use in killing them?
So they used all kinds of methods. Um, some are weird, like there were instances where people would take pots of sulfur and burn it and place it under nesting birds, and the chicks would be asphyxiated. My own personal favorite occurred in Orilla, Ontario. Um, Potato farmers, as they were getting their crop, if the birds were flying low, they'd actually hurl potatoes at the birds, occasionally knocking some out of the sky. So you'd have, most of the ingredients of the stew at your feet. But the two principal ways they were killed, Shorger thinks more were killed by shooting. And even that, guns in the 17 and 1800s, blunderbuss type, lots of different pellets came out. People claimed with a single shot they may have killed 90 birds. The single shot that undoubtedly took more birds than any other occurred at a British fort on the northern shore of Lake Huron, and soldiers noticed this huge flight, and they filled their cannon with grape bullets, little tiny pellets, and shot into it. And the one of the people present said it made very great slaughter. The other way was with nets. They would, and the netting, they could catch maybe hundreds of birds at a time. There are accounts of some of the trappers running out, getting under the net and actually biting down on the back of the head to kill it. Some though were kept alive. They were used. They would then be shipped to for shooting contests, which which could kill 40,000 birds. I mean, they occurred in Chicago and New York and other places. One interesting element that many hunters use to increase their effort, they use what's become known as a stool pigeon. Stool pigeons were captive passenger pigeons. They usually had their eyes sewed shut so they wouldn't spook when the wild birds came. So they would throw out the seed, wild birds would fly over, and they would mount the pass the tame bird, the stool pigeon, on what was almost like a teeter totter. And so they could manipulate that up and down by ropes while they were in the blind. So when the pigeons, the wild ones, came over, they would see this bird that appeared to be feeding peacefully. And so that would attract the birds and increase the amount of birds that they caught by nets. And I was trying. Oh yeah. So one of the last big nesting was in Petoskey, Michigan, in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, and a team of three netters over the course of their time there caught 50,000 pigeons by using nets.
Um, how could they all, billions of birds be wiped out in such a short time?
Okay. So they there were always markets for them, but in the 1840s, there was the introduction of the telegraph and the railroad. So no matter how remote an area was where pigeons roosted, if there was someone there and they had access to a telegraph, that information could be widely disseminated. And if people came to hunt them, all they needed to get to was a train station, which could then take them to the urban markets in St. Louis, Chicago, and to the east. So there, that allowed the pigeons a national market for the pigeons. The pigeons were the cheapest terrestrial protein available. The U.S. population was soaring in the late 1800s, and you could buy them, for a very low amount. Indeed, in some of the sites where there were so many killed that in Michigan, where I just mentioned, um, they used dead birds to fill potholes in the road. There were other places where they fed the pigeons to pigs because there simply was no market. But as time went on, human population increased, and there was value in the urban markets. We don't know for sure, but there was anywhere from 700 to 1,500 people who did nothing but chase the birds. If there was they may be in Pennsylvania, and if there was a report of birds in Michigan, they go after them. So there was a continuous uh, slaughter, and it's also important in evaluating that to keep in mind that the pigeons only nested once a year and only produced one young a year. They laid one egg. And so, they weren't able to replace the losses. It's also the case that, um, as the birds, as the east side, because of timber and whatnot, the eastern part of the U.S. ceased to be really good for them. There were fewer places they could nest. So there's still plenty of food, still places to be, but the fact that there were fewer places in Pennsylvania, again, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, um, you could access. It made it easier to access those places, and it made you closer to the markets. There were big nests in Ontario that were just never really um, what documented closely, but that factor that there were fewer places for them to nest, people. That's all they did, and it was easier to get to markets. Really, I think is the key to why they and their and their breeding nature is what 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 led to the very rapid disappearance of the bird.
Tell us about the last big nestings.
Sure. So that was in the 1870s, and the the biggest nesting ever recorded was in 1871 north of the Wisconsin Dells. And Shorter, I discovered this actually going. He went. He was a Madison businessman, and he spent his lunches at the Wisconsin Historical Society reading every newspaper ever published in Wisconsin before 1900, and um, took from that all accounts of natural history. And so he found in 1871 in this vast area, which he estimated to be 850 square miles, and he figured that he estimated that there were 136 million birds there. Now, at the same time, there was a flock nesting in Minnesota of a few million. But then the next and the last big flock occurred in 1878 um, in Petoskey, Michigan. It was a smaller area and probably involved maybe more like 34 million birds. Um, in 1880 in Benzie County, Michigan, there were millions. Um, a really weird one was the biggest nesting in 1881, and that was on Potawatomi land in Oklahoma. Um, and it was really 1882 was the last year that there were nestings of over a million. There were a few in Wisconsin and one in Pennsylvania. And then from then on, they were small and certainly did draw the number of hunters that those earlier ones did.
Martha was the last individual of her species. How about the last wild pigeon?
Sure. The We don't know with certainty, but Shorter proclaimed that the last wild passenger pigeon was a bird called Buttons, shot in 1900 in south central Ohio. It was called Buttons. It was an immature male, excuse me, an immature female, which is important because it shows that even when there were virtually none less left, a pair could fledge a young. So the idea that they could only reproduce in huge numbers was generally the case, but not always. And it was called Buttons because the taxidermist who was given the specimen had run out of glass eyes and put buttons in it. Buttons is at the Ohio Historical Society Museum. Now, I discovered two other birds. One was shot in Oakford, Illinois in 1901. And it's this beautiful male that's called Big Blue. It's on display at Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois, if you're ever down there. The documentation is really strong. Then the last wild bird that I think there is no doubt about was shot in 1902 in Laurel, Indiana. Unfortunately, the specimen is no longer extant, but um, Amos Butler, who was Indiana's premier ornithologist at the time, did examine the bird in his hand. It was a male. There's no way he would have misidentified it. So I believe that that was the last fully documented uh, bird. There certainly were other sightings, and I don't know if you're going to ask specifically, but we've talked about this, Laura, before. You know, the bird that the flock of seven that Theodore Roosevelt saw in 1907, but it was just a sighting, and I think it's important. Shorter believed, as do I, that really because of their similarity to mourning doves, you really need to have had a specimen. And an example of that was a bird. There was a nest reported in Maine in 1920, and word reached the American Museum of Natural History, and Ludlow Griscom, one of the again premier ornithologists of the country, and a colleague went to Maine, and the people and they went because one of the people who vouched for the record had been a hunter and said, "Oh, I know these birds really well." And other people, yeah, we know them. Well, they went up and it was a mourning dove, a pair of mourning doves. And even then, some of these people refused to acknowledge that it was a mourning dove. So who knows? We don't know with absolute certainty, but the evidence is pretty strong that the birds were gone by the last few years of the 20th century.
Yeah, there's a new TV series called The Residents, and the main character is an obsessed birder. She reminds me of myself a little bit. But she was trying to see all the birds that Teddy Roosevelt had seen on the White House grounds because he kept a list of them. That's why she says purple grackle, because that's the way he listed it, even though we know it's the common grackle now. But she mentioned his reporting those passenger pigeons, not at the White House, but that was one
Well,
of
they
her.
also, during that discussion on the show, there's a brief flash that there's a young bird, a chick, and that's from Whitman's flock in Chicago. And they even have one of the cross painting that we're going to see later on in this talk. So that struck me as well.
A reader asked why there weren't more concerted efforts to stop the slaughter.
Yeah, so states started, protecting birds. I mean, some of these early state laws were really weird. Oklahoma said you can't kill birds that have pretty songs. Um, but the pigeon, the first state to put some restriction was Vermont. But it was like the distance. You couldn't destroy the eggs. In New York in 1861 said you couldn't shoot inside the nest site. I mean, you can kill them away from it. So there really weren't any strong state laws. Finally, I mean, only one state banned all killing of passenger pigeons, and that was Michigan, but it was in 1897 when the birds were already gone. Now, the other important point is no matter what, because these birds were so agile, they moved constantly, really, um, it would take federal law. And the very first federal law related to bird protection was the Lacey Act in 1900. And when Lacey gave his introduced the bill on the floor of the U.S. House, he said it's too late for the passenger pigeon, but there's still much work to be done. So the pigeon was a major factor, not the only to be sure, but a factor in triggering the country's first great environmental movement. And then, that was 1900. Basically, the Lacey Act says that if you kill a bird at a place that's legal, you cannot then export it to a place where it's illegal. And then in 1918 was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which the Supreme Court upheld 2 years later. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but it's really heartbreaking that there's talk that the administration is talking about, weakening some of those laws.
And
But the
letting
point is
them
that you needed.
sunset.
I'm sorry.
They're talking about letting them sunset, become obsolete.
Yeah, which here's a law that's been really really important, and you need and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act recognized it's not just the U.S., but a lot of our birds breed in Canada, and we've subsequently signed treaties with Mexico, even with Russia, because Alaska, there's birds that move across the Bering Strait. So, I mean, people realize that if you're going to preserve birds, you have to preserve them throughout their range.
What impacts did the bird's extinction have?
Well, that's hard. Again, because the birds were never studied, so we don't know for sure. Um, one, well, a couple of thoughts. pertain to diseases to people. So the idea is that when these mastings occurred and the birds gathered in huge numbers, they reduced the forage available to rodents, which are the reservoir for Lyme's disease. So the idea is wasn't until the pigeons were gone that the population of rodents increased enough then for Lyme disease to be readily transmitted to people. Um, Eastern encephalitis, uh, which there were outbreaks in the early 20th century in New England. The mosquito, uh, there's a mosquito that breeds in swamps and lives on birds. And then when other mosquitoes uh, go to the birds and then pick it up, they're vectors then to humans. The idea there is that when passenger pigeons were abundant and they moved around so much, they never gathered in these places long enough to have high uh, degrees of infection. And it wasn't until they were eliminated and replaced by birds like redwings or robins, birds that didn't move as much, and they were exposed to the disease for longer periods, that they were then able to become um, reservoirs that could be passed on to people. Those are just two examples, and again, we don't really know for one just one other thing comes to mind. So in Kentucky, there was this big nesting. Eventually, the birds were killed off, the trees were cut, but the farmers noticed that the land that had been the roost was much richer than surrounding acreage due to the constant fertilizing of that land. I mean, those are just a few examples.
Um, Around the time of Martha's centennial of her death, I started hearing a lot of people talking about resurrecting species using DNA. And now there's news of the supposed resurrection of the dire wolf. And people are saying that captive breeding and recreating living specimens of extinct birds from DNR are ways of overriding extinction. What do you think about this and the dangers of thinking this way?
So with the pigeon, the first effort was begun by the Long Now Foundation and their Revive and Restore project. These were created by Stuart Brand and his wife Ryan Phelan. Stuart became wealthy and became famous by starting the Whole Earth catalog, which I presume a lot of us would remember. And I was invited actually to attend their first meeting in 2013 at the Harvard Medical School. The host was a fellow who was part of the figuring out the human genome. One of the things that was interesting to me is there were bird people there and there were genetics people. And, there was they flew in somebody, a law professor from Stanford. So, I mean, they expended a lot of resources on this, but the bird people were the ones who were most skeptical. It was the people that were more into the technology of it. Um, so what they and we help. I mean, I help them um, find this other bird, which is so. Although passenger pigeons look like mourning doves, they're most closely related to a genus that I have trouble pronouncing, but it includes band-tailed pigeons, red-billed pigeons, white-crowned pigeons. So I got them connected with a guy who had band tails. So what they did is they took DNA from passenger pigeon feet from the Field Museum, and then mixed that in with band tails. So the first um, generation had virtually no passenger pigeon DNA. I mean, there was no. You look at the birds, and they were very much band tails. So it's going to take a long, long time before they create, a hybrid that begins to look a little bit like a mourning dove. Now, or a passenger pigeon, I should say. But that raises another question too. Mourning doves are shot every year than any other game bird. So if you did create this number of mourning dove-like birds, they're probably going to be shot if you just let them fly. So that's, and they're never going to reach the numbers uh, that the passenger pigeons did. Now, I guess one beneficial thing was they did some of the DNA work and they showed that the pigeons had huge numbers for many centuries. There have been a number of canards, one in the book 1491 that says, it's based on a flawed study that somebody did, that the native people kept the population low, and it wasn't until they were eradicated that, or reduced, I should say, that the pigeons grew. And there's the opposite canard that, in fact, we killed the pigeons to harm the Indians, but the wars on the east side of the Mississippi, had ended way before that. So they did establish certain facts in the preliminary, but in terms of the actual effort, something new with the dire wolf, and that's a reflection of the administration. Back when, 2014, 2015, when they started this restore project, revive and restore, um, I don't remember any government officials saying, hey, who cares if we get them extinct? We can always bring them back, And now with the dire wolf situation, where there was a little bit of dire wolf DNA introduced into a gray wolf, and again, why you're bringing back something that's been gone for thousands of years makes no sense to me. But some have grabbed on that as an excuse to not care at all about what we do to critters that are still extant. That's just 10 years difference in how certain groups have perceived those efforts.
Yeah. A reader asked how you would compare the tragedy of the passenger pigeon with the enormous declines in bird populations in North America over the past
Yeah, well,
several
the passenger
decades.
pigeon's decline, in my view, was because humans slaughtered them. There are four principal, as I understand it, four principal factors behind bird declines. One is habitat loss, and as part of that, um, you're replacing, whatever habitat there was in urban areas with big buildings that lead to massive numbers of birds dying from collisions. So that's one real high factor of mortality. Um, a second is direct take, which is what we did with the pigeons. There are laws now, I'm sure most countries, certainly, Europe, United States, Canada, where that limit how many birds you can take. Although an analogy 10 years ago, and we dealt with this in the film, to what happened to the passenger pigeon is fishing, because the open waters are not part of any sovereign body. So there can be no control unless a variety of nations agree to it. And the technology has allowed uh, fishing ships with the nets they have, they can remove in one haul all the fish from the bottom to the surface. So the rapidity with which some of these fish populations are being reduced, sharks and other things, um, that may come close. Um, a third one is pollution, and that would include climate change. And the fourth is introduced species, and there's a lot of examples. And one is the brown tree snake, a snake of Asia and Australia, was introduced on the island of Guam and virtually wiped out most of the birds. One species became extinct. Um, Mosquitoes were introduced into Hawaii in the early 1800s, and they were spreading various diseases, which reduced the population substantially. The Hawaiian archipelago has lost more birds than anywhere else in the world, but what saved a lot of the birds was they lived high enough on the mountains that it was too cold for the mosquitoes. But then, and here's where factors coming together exacerbate the situation with climate warming. That means that the mosquitoes could move higher up, leaving even less room for the birds. There are other examples, but those are four are two good examples. So I mean that's the difference. There's a number of factors involved in this current loss of birds, whereas the pigeon was done without pre-science. Nobody was doing surveys. There were not laws. There weren't organizations that were active. So it was a different time that we're living in now. And if we, boy, forget those lessons, that doesn't speak well of us.
Let's get to the personal. How did you personally get so interested in passenger pigeons? And a reader asked how you were able to sustain the energy and motivation across 5 years of documenting this historic
No, there's,
tragedy.
yeah. So, I mean, it probably was when I was in elementary school, there's a book, Birds of America by Gilbert Pearson. And I took the book out three times, and on the fourth time, the librarian suggested I pick another book. But that's probably how I was first introduced to passenger pigeons. But I became a birder in 1967, in November, excuse me, November 9th, 1966. And over the years, so you see changes. So, for example, where I got my lifer bobolink in Northbrook, Illinois, is now a playground in the middle of a subdivision. So, as time went on, I mean, I became really interested in what I call historical natural history. So, one book, and my books take forever. My 17 it took 17 years to do a natural history of the Chicago region, which documented the changes that occurred in this area from the time Europeans first arrived until the present. And so, studying those, reading old accounts, passenger pigeons were pretty prominent. So, I mean, I became, pretty knowledgeable and invested in it. The other question is interesting to me because it's writing about birds that have been gone a long time, but there is an emotional toll. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. About the same time that I was working on this, Tim Snyder, who is a historian at Yale University, wrote an incredible book called Bloodlands. He looked um, at a period from about 1935 to 1945 in Eastern Europe and documented the slaughter of like 17 million people. So the Nazis killed roughly 6 million Jews. Decisions by Stalin created famine in Ukraine, which killed about half that number, and there were other slaughters. And I wondered, if I'm affected by birds, how could he keep up his interest in what he was doing? And there may be downsides to the internet, but one good thing is you could look up a professor at Yale, go to the Yale website, and I emailed him, and he responded, and he said it was very difficult. He believed strongly in the project. He said he tried to sleep well, he exercised. I mean, he was so, you become really committed to the cause. And with me too, it wasn't just me. There was Project Passenger Pigeon. There was a community of people scattered around, uh, who who are who are very interested in this as well. So that buoys your spirits a bit.
Okay, well, we have pictures to look at. Um, so we'll have to enlist Marion's aid. But one of the participants just asked if the people harvesting the pigeons were the same who over harvested whooping cranes.
Oh,
Do you
no,
know?
no. I mean, whooping cranes never existed in those numbers. Um, and their numbers were, pretty low in what the early 20th century. There were like 14 left or something. So it wasn't comparable to them. There never was, there never were those efforts because there just weren't nearly as many.
And another, Mike Menzel asks, are there estimates when the bird population reached its peak, and how many years prior to the beginning of the slaughter did the population of this size exist?
Well, I mean, uh, Schorger, estimated that there were 3 to 5 billion birds. So in his view, 5 billion was probably 3 to 5 billion, and that was based on the amount of habitat. Again, roughly a third of the United States and Canada, and he based it on that. I mean, it is an estimate. We don't know for sure. So if that's probably the highest estimate is 3 to 5 billion. So this picture is from a place that many of you no doubt can recognize. It's the Bell Museum. And two things that affect me. It was that image that's on the cover of my book. The other thing is that as the pigeon during the 1880s and 90s, um, there were milestones. So the last bird shot in a given state. Well, in June of 1895, a fellow near Minneapolis killed the last passenger pigeon ever killed in Minnesota, but also collected the last nest and egg ever found. And and all those materials he later donated to the Bell Museum. So, that's a significant, again, event in the history of the bird. And Laura, you had an experience as well.
Is that the next picture? At the Bell Museum, I brought my children when they were very little, and my daughter had just started keeping a life list. In this picture, I think she is 4 years old, and she had just started keeping a life list. She was very assiduous about it. And I brought her to the museum. I hadn't told, they didn't know anything about extinction except the dinosaurs were gone, and you can see they're all wearing a dinosaur shirt because we
Ah,
also went to a dinosaur exhibit that day at the Science Museum. But when she saw these birds, her eyes grew wide and she said she couldn't wait to see them, to add to her life list. And I had to explain right there in the Bell Museum that they were extinct. And she and Joey, the older of the two boys, they were so distraught. And when Russ decided to take our picture at the display, they both decided to show how sad they were.
well,
Tommy was a little too little to notice he was still two.
yeah, that's touching, and I mean that's inspiring to be with younger people, who are committed to trying to make the world better, or youngsters who react in that emotional way to something as powerful and profound as the extinction of this species.
Okay, go back to Joel's pictures now.
Okay, so it's the next picture. That's Bell Museum. Next is Cross. There we go.
Making
I don't
it
know how
bigger.
well
I
you
can
can.
get it bigger for you. Just a second.
Okay,
Shoot. I'm sorry.
no problem.
Here we go. Nope, not that one. There we go.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite paintings, and you have to, look closely. It's in the book. I mean, if you have a copy of it, it's by Lewis Cross, who was trained as a painter, uh, lived near Grand Rapids, wasn't known, and I kind of take some good feeling that I'm sure my book introduced him to a much wider audience. This is what he said of the pigeons. He said, "There are not many of us left who remember the pigeon as they were then. Maybe my work is not artistic, but it is historical. I can remember back to the 1870s when the sky would be so filled with them, the sun would be obscured for as long as an hour. At other times, when the sun was in the right position, a flock would appear as a perfect rainbow caused by their iridescent coloring." Meaning there are lots, Audubon, one of the most iconic, and Wilson. But I think this, is a really dramatic, moving picture. You can see it at the Muskegon Museum of History and Science. They have a museum center, and when you walk in, that's over the doorway. So this is a still life, and I don't know how well you can see it, but the point is all three of those, passenger pigeon, rabbit, and meadowlark, were common food during the 1800s. They were frequently featured in 19th century markets. There was a guy named Thomas DeVoe who wrote a book in 1853 called The Market Assistant, which discussed the gustatory qualities of all the birds he encountered in the New York market. So he actually wasn't so pleased with older passenger pigeons because they were tough. What he really liked were spring flickers, a woodpecker that feeds on ants. But it makes the point that, things we would never imagine eating now, were common food sources back then before there were any restrictions on the taking of birds.
This picture also gives a really good sense of how big they were
Yeah.
compared to the rabbit and the meadowlark.
So this is the collection at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum in Chicago. Given that the pigeon was the most abundant bird in life, there are more specimens of them than of any other extinct bird. Uh, the largest passenger pigeon collection in the world is at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. They have about 152 specimens, including 10 sets of eggs. And the major reason why that's the case is because they had a museum volunteer named Paul Hahn who combed the province. Ontario, went to bars, went to restaurants, barber shops from 1918 to 1960, buying every passenger pigeon he could find. So, and there's a wonderful book he did called "Where's That Vanished Bird," which lists every. There actually was a specimen at a museum in Borneo. It's not there anymore. So, these birds were collected by lots of people and wound up in lots of places. So there are relatively few photos of live birds. I think this is Martha when she was in Cincinnati. Almost all of them are from the flocks kept by Charles Otis Whitman at University of Chicago and the Cincinnati Zoo. Next picture, please. This is one of the few that is of a bird used by trappers as a stool pigeon. You can see the image. It's hard to see, but there are two or three passenger pigeons below. So there are a few captive birds. Next shot. But there are even fewer examples of freshly killed birds. I mean, with all the slaughter, uh, I have only found two photos. Other people have looked too. One is a photo from Michigan where you can't tell at all from the photo. There's birds hanging. I mean, they're blurred, but based on what the photographer said at the time, they probably were pigeons. This is I was so thrilled when I learned of this shot. It's a stereopticon photo taken in the 1870s. and it's called Wild Small Wild Game in the Alleghenies. Um, and if any, I often will do this. So for those of you watching this presentation, if any of you know, you know, of any photos of freshly killed birds, please get in touch with me through Marion or whatever, because it would be. I'd love to find another one. One time it was in Michigan. Somebody, a historical society, said, "Yes, yes, we have them. There's three or four birds dead on a car." Hood. I thought, that's not likely. And they were rough grouse. So, uh,
Oops.
but anyway, if anyone does know of that, please let me know. So we mentioned before, I think, the last of the wild birds. So this is Big Blue, killed on March 25th, 1901, in Oakford, Illinois, not that far from Springfield. Well documented, and it was published, but it wasn't in something that Shorter would have looked at. And it's a beautiful bird, and it's on display, as I mentioned, uh, at Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois. So if you're ever down that way, uh, encourage you to take a look. I think that's the last of the photos.
Thank you, Laura and Joel. That was wonderful. It looks like we have a few minutes for questions. And we saw the question. Did we answer the question about the whooping cranes?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, then
we
I'm
uh,
gonna.
uh, we answered both of those.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any other questions, you can enter them in the Q&A chat. And I wanted to kick it off with a question. You mentioned the captive flock that was kept at the University of Chicago, and I was wondering if they intentionally like let that flock die out or what happened to it and um how it dwindled down.
So there were three flocks. Say in 1900, there was a small flock in Milwaukee that was kept by a guy. And apparently some of those birds were stolen and wound up in Chicago. There's a number of stories like that, but some of those were returned to the guy. And then Cincinnati, which is the second oldest zoo in the country, was founded in 1871. Uh, they had some too. Um, Whitman, I mean, I don't think anybody. Well, Whitman wasn't per se interested in. He was interested in bird behavior. He had hundreds of birds in his collection, but the point is that of course they got old, and they were inbred because there was no way to bring in. There were no wild birds to augment these birds that you had had for a long time. So the Milwaukee flock disappeared. It wasn't as well documented. Um, Whitman, uh, and Whitman did experiments. He mated a passenger pigeon with another pigeon to create hybrids. But basically, that was the issue: is that they were old. They just weren't breeding anymore, and whatever breeding occurred, it was pretty inbred. And then there was Cincinnati, uh, which started with a larger collection, but the same problem. And as again, it wasn't like you could uh, go out and get a wild bird to uh, increase the genetic variety of your captives.
And a question for Laura. We saw the photo of you with your kids at the Bell and the poignant story of having to tell your daughter that she'll never see a passenger pigeon. So in that photo, you look like a very early career birder and bird conservationist. What was that? Did that experience shape your career or your approach to birding in any meaningful way that you could share with us?
Well, when I was a teacher in my previous life before having my own children, I would take my kids. Um, we were walking distance to the in Madison, Wisconsin, to the university's zoology museum. And the kids, when birds would hit their windows or when they'd find a roadkill, they knew how to write all the information and freeze it and double bag it, and then we'd call the museum. And if the specimen was in good shape and it was what he wanted, he would want us to bring it to the museum. Otherwise, we would prepare the study specimen and bring it to them. And they were pretty ratty looking compared to the professional ones. But so we would have multiple field trips over there. And every time we had a field trip, Frank Iwin, the curator, would bring out the passenger pigeons. He would have every sixth grade boy sobbing with his talking about it. And it was so moving. I was an avid birder already, and this was very seminal. The importance of knowing what we've lost and knowing how to protect it to prevent it. That's what made me need to write my book, 101 Ways to Help Birds, because we have to do everything we can possibly do to prevent another passenger pigeon tragedy.
Okay, we have
It
a
might be worth mentioning that in modern, we haven't lost that many species here in, North America. I mean, the Great Auk in 1844, but it was on islands and it wasn't here. I mean, Hawaii's lost some birds, but in terms of the mainland, I mean, there was the passenger pigeon, Carolina parakeet, um, Eskimo curlew, ivory-billed. We'll assume for the sake of this that they're gone. Bachman's water. I mean, there's five, six things. I mean, it could have been worse, I suppose.
But some are on the brink. And the worst thing about the Endangered Species Act isn't that it can be really, really effective, but it's all the bureaucratic hurdles a bird has to get through to be named endangered. Um, there's no way Gunnison sage grouse or even the greater sage grouse should not be listed as threatened and or endangered, and yet people can still hunt them. And the lesser prairie chicken is in so much trouble.
And
And
it's
when I'm,
breeding with graders, which is exacerbating that problem.
yeah, it's just such a tragedy. So, yeah. And now we're going to have even more hurdles to protecting species unless someone like you cares a whole lot, awful lot. Nothing's going to get better. It's not.
Well, I actually have seen a bird that has become extinct. Back in the day, there were three species of seaside sparrows: the Cape sable, the dusky, and the common or whatever, the one that with the large population. So I saw it in 1972. My parents let me skip high school graduation and go on a bird trip to Florida. I saw at that point they had already, well, they were a species then, but saw a dusky seaside sparrow. There were only a few, left, and then they taxonomically they ceased being individual species, so the status went down. But it's pretty touching to say that I've in my lifetime have seen at least not a species maybe, but a population, a subspecies. That the last one died. If the last, Martha died in Cincinnati Zoo, the last Dusky Seaside died in Disney World, um, and they tried, but they could save it.
So we have two questions on ground we've covered. Someone asked about the dire wolf and whether anyone is thinking about resurrecting the passenger pigeon. We did discuss that earlier in the program at length, and so I will post this video on our YouTube channel, and you can watch from the beginning the parts that you missed. But Joel gave a great answer that might be a little too lengthy to repeat here. Then Jane Dickerson just said that she missed where Laura said about taking a class to a museum where the boys were sobbing, and where were they?
That was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison at the Zoology Museum when the wonderful Frank Iwin was the curator. He would always have the kids' specimens that we had brought to the museum, whether we'd prepared it or whether one of the professionals had. They all had this perfect calligraphy little label on them, and he always remembered which ones to pull out for my kids. He was just wonderful. But he said not many elementary school teachers take their kids to the zoology museum to look at things. That I couldn't understand why not. I sure took advantage of it.
Is it free?
It was, yeah.
Oh,
I
well,
don't know. I don't know how much people do that sort of thing now. This was back in the 70s.
mm,
Um, but yeah, it was a wonderful resource.
One thing, and this is sort of off topic maybe, but um, museums, I mean, there's lots of examples that I can cite my own, but there are others too. Museums kind of recognize they're open to young people. I mean, when they meet an enthusiastic kid, who just loves mammals, birds, uh, geology, they'll many curators, I mean, not everyone maybe, but even some of those with reputations for being prickly will spend some time with the kid. I mean, they recognize, that's sort of the way they were. And if they could help, inspire, help a kid, uh, on this passage into this important world of nature, um, they'll they often do it. They have programs for the summers. Field had a program with high school kids, and all of them, some are working on their doctorates. Some, I mean, they're lifelong students of birds.
And they're
so
cool.
true.
The illustrator at the Madison Muse at the Zoology Museum drew. He was John Dahlman, and he drew a picture of a wood stork carrying a baby who's looking at the wood stork through binoculars and lettered it, "It's a lifer," because I told him I wanted that picture for my birth announcements when I had my kids. And he just did this wonderful picture.
Wow. Do you still have that?
Of course.
Yeah.
I have it also on my one of my birding friends up here, Jim Lind in Two Harbors, used that for his. I gave him permission to use it for his birth announcement too.
That's so great. I did an e-baby alert
Yeah.
for mine. It was a rarity
Well,
announcement.
well, now we know that storks are closely related to vultures, so I don't know if that changes.
Beginning and end of life. I've done radio shows about that,
There you go.
Right.
but they
Well, I did post the link to the Project Passenger Pigeon project, or I just said project twice, but it's in the chat, and I would encourage everyone to check it out. And I just wanted to um, open the floor to Joel and Laura to see if they have any last remarks or reflections, either on the book, on passenger pigeons, on birds, anything at all.
I mean, we have to stay vigilant, and this is if you're in that that group that really cares about the importance of biological diversity, of the aesthetics. I mean, all the reasons why uh, people like Laura and you and me, and probably most people watching. So, I mean, do what you can. I mean, the threats are out there, and you know how you vote or where you give your money. Do whatever you can.
ditto.
Um, Well, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And as I mentioned, we will post this on our YouTube channel. And I wanted us all to give a hearty but silent round of applause to our two guests. And
Well, thank you.
I just wanted to thank you again. We all learned so much. It looks like we have one more question. Do we have time for it? Um, Maybe I think we're at the end of the program, so I'll just, if you can email your question into me at contact@llbirdalliance.org, I will get an answer to you. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Laura and Joel, and happy Earth Day to all of you. Good night.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you very much.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.